businesses, they needed multiple levels, like account management, user access management becomes super important. So we kind of built a very powerful feature that allows one person to make payments, the other one to approve payments.
Right.
When it comes to cards, being able to give cards to multiple employees and kind of manage it from an expense perspective becomes very important.
Hey, welcome to this week's episode of Homescreen. Today, I'm delighted to be chatting with Neil Luo, who is the head of growth at Airwallex, the Australian B2B FX and business banking project. This is a really fascinating product with origins in mainland China and moving over to some different markets around the world. Neil's based in Melbourne. Today, we're going to be talking through quite a few different bits of functionality that they offer. So the first one is the payments functionality. Then we're going to take a look at creating these US dollar accounts, which you can do so via their product. Then we have the ability to connect the product via Xero. This gives the user the ability to control the amount of the accounting software that runs through their product. And then finally, the ability to generate virtual cards to do spending for different businesses. So be sure to check that out. Hey, Neil, how are you doing?
Good. Hey, James, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Just, I guess, struggling through the last stages of the lockdown here in the UK. How's it over there in Australia?
Yeah, we're like, our numbers are pretty low. I think we've kind of lifted restrictions and
Oh, cool.
It's kind of getting close to normal. So hopefully you guys are getting close as well.
Yeah, I hope so. So could you just start off by telling us a bit more about yourself, how you ended up getting involved with Airwallex?
Yeah, so my background, I originally started in consulting. So I kind of did 3 years at BCG, then moved to London, actually spent 7 years in London in tech. So that was kind of my first foray into tech. It was more consumer and it was more online tech, but really, really enjoyed that. Was kind of towards the end of my stay at Expedia, I was on the marketing side, so driving a lot of the digital marketing efforts, both from a data science and technology perspective. Then decided to move back to Australia. Found myself at an online jobs company, thinking it was going to be very exciting from a tech perspective. It probably wasn't the right choice. So when Airwallex came knocking on my door, I was super excited. I hadn't heard of them, to be honest, but they were rapidly growing and hiring. And what really kind of attracted me to Airwallex was just the pace, like the growth, both in the fintech space and my role as head of growth and driving that customer acquisition.
Yeah, just a general point around that sort of. So your role is in the growth side of things, and I feel as though this is a role that's definitely sort of growing. Has been growing over the past 5 years-ish, 10 years maybe. But people didn't used to think about growth as a role. They didn't used to think of notions of growth hacking or anything like that. Or how do you go about sort of what is your practice for doing growth? What does a day in the life of a growth person look like to you?
Yeah, I think growth, in my view, is actually not just driving the demand, but also making sure that the unit economics work. Right, and that's really important. That's the one thing I learned when I was kind of at Expedia. Is like you can't just say, "Oh, I'm bringing this many customers," but kind of what's the return on investment, right? So that's really important that you kind of both drive the demand, but then look at the product and say, "Hey, how well is that competing? How well is that monetizing?" I'd say that in a B2B space, it's probably less. I'd say growth hacking. So I think in the consumer space, there's a lot of cool things you can do to kind of get viral loops. We're kind of very focused on business, and that's kind of the unique customer proposition for Airwallex. And in B2B space, you actually need to build a lot of credibility, a lot of trust. How do we leverage the natural characteristics of our product, which is payments, to actually drive further growth, right? So potentially using that payment mechanism to drive customer acquisition. So we do a lot of that. And then we also try to be very clear on kind of what is the business pain point we're trying to solve. And then how do we build content around educating or proving that we are solving these pain points very effectively. And then pushing that out into the right channels, whether it's social media, whether it's through other kind of partnership channels, webinars, etc.
For those that maybe don't know, you tell us a little bit about what Airwallex does and what space you're playing in at the minute.
Yeah, sure. So I think the vision for Airwallex is very much building what we call global financial services infrastructure. So our product is very much for businesses that want to grow internationally. Our vision is that over the next 5 to 10 years, the digital economy is going to grow more and more. And with that comes more opportunity for cross-border kind of expansion, for cross-border e-commerce. So our vision is very much around how do we enable those businesses in that world. And a lot of our core product is around the financial services aspect, right? So how do you send payments overseas in a cost-effective manner? How do you open accounts overseas for your business? How do you create a card that you can use, but potentially also employees in your business overseas can potentially use?
Right.
How do you pay employees overseas? So they're kind of some of the problems that we're trying to solve, and both kind of from a cost-effective manner, because there are some large businesses that really focus on their cost and want to minimize that, but also for kind of the medium businesses, how do you do it while saving them time as well?
Okay. It seems as though potentially you're not playing in the same space at all with these players, but there is some similarities in the way that TransferWise and their borderless account program and Revolut will offer sort of for the customer, like the sort of retail customer, they'll offer a similar style of project. Is there any similarities in the way that sort of B2C product and your B2B product operates?
Yeah, I'd say I think there is this kind of common misconception that we're doing the same. And in essence, at some level, it's the same, right? It's like sending a payment from A to B,
Sure.
Opening a bank account from A to B. But what we find is the business need can be very different. So, for example, with businesses, they need multiple levels, like account management, user access management becomes super important. So we kind of built a very powerful feature that allows one person to make payments, the other one to approve payments.
Right.
When it comes to cards, being able to give cards to multiple employees and kind of manage it from an expense perspective becomes very important. Right.
Yeah.
So I'd say that we're probably much more focused on those business needs, right? So I'd say it's probably kind of similar to some of the products out there, but with kind of the added capabilities that businesses really need to drive growth.
Did the company start off with the notion that this was always going to be the case, or have you found that there have been some sort of quirks to working with businesses that you maybe didn't expect?
Yeah, so the interesting genesis for us, I think, is, we're quite different to some of the players in the UK market, where we actually started a lot more on the enterprise side. So a lot of people actually know this, but we tried to solve FX and payments for enterprise customers in China. Right, that's actually where we started.
Right.
And there's a lot of growth there. A lot of people, businesses trying to, China's been growing heaps. They're trying to send money overseas. There just wasn't a player there.
Yeah.
And we actually built it all API first. So all our products is actually API first, right? And actually integrate. And then as we've kind of had that growth in China, we're now saying, hey, how do we, one, move outside of China? And then how do we, secondly, move from that enterprise space into more the kind of SME, small, medium enterprise space, right? And so that's kind of where our focus.
The market's as glaringly massive as it is in the UK. I mean, I seem to remember there's been massive amounts of mandates to incentivize businesses to support SMEs. SMEs represent around half of UK GDP, and there is a huge space there for businesses to come in and to get funding from bodies like RBS, the bank here in the UK, and other sort of programs that have been based around that. And so I guess the question there is, like, is the market as massive in sort of, well, in the whole area where you guys are based?
Yeah, I think there is, right? I think, we know that SMEs in general are very underserved by the banks. And I think at a global level, like, even more so, like I just recently talked to a company in Australia who has offices in the UK and the US, but they're just not big enough to get the rates that they want from the banks. Like, the banks are just too small, right? So we're really trying to level that playing field, and where the Nikes and Apples have these Citibanks and JP Morgan serving them at a global level. A lot of these SMEs who by nature will start becoming more and more global as the world opens up, don't really have that banking capability that can kind of serve them at that global level. And that's kind of where we really want to play.
So you mentioned then, you touched on the fact that there is maybe a Chinese origin to the product. In terms of your recent sort of funding, I believe there was an important sort of Series D level funding coming in recently where Tencent were also involved, amongst a range of other providers. But it also makes splashy news when organizations like Tencent get involved in the investments. So can you talk a little bit about what the fundraising round consisted of and what the aims for that were?
Yeah, so I think for us, we managed to raise a Series D over 160 million US. So we're really happy about that. Like you said, we have actually a range of investors. So Tencent is one of our investors. This 160 million round was actually a combination of existing and new investors. So Tencent was actually an existing investor. Some of the other investors we've had come on board are kind of ANZ, which is a big bank in Australia, Salesforce, which is a big brand in the US, and also DST Global, which is quite well known for their investments in kind of Airbnb, Spotify, and Facebook. And really, it's to fuel kind of our global expansion ambitions. So we have a real commitment to kind of go global, as is our mantra, right? For to support business go global. And so that fund is very much around fueling that global growth. And the UK and Europe is one big focus area for us.
Okay. And you also very briefly there touched on the fact that these are API-based services. And you've recently launched an issuing API, which I guess will allow you to generate and issue the payment cards to different networks. Is this along the lines of the types of things you're going to be sort of doing more in a product perspective? Is it growing out of these API endpoints, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the way we think about it is we have kind of two broad products. One is what we call platform API. So we kind of we have like an FX API, a payments API, and an issuing API. We're actually also building a payment gateway API. So really kind of have this kind of platform infrastructure that clients can connect to. And then on top of these APIs, we build a user experience. So kind of that web app is all about the user experience. And then we will determine what capabilities we want from those APIs based on kind of the key problems we're trying to solve for the user.
Cool. Well, I think that's a good jump off point to talk about actual payments on the platform. So this is the desktop view, you guys, and into the transfers nav item on the left hand side, we have the option to generate two different types of payment and then to see what looks like a transaction feed. We've got our sort of payment details and then a sort of to and from sending and receiving set of boxes. We see there that dynamically the amount of money there changes as we enter in the receiving amount. And then we have other additional details, I would imagine, for logging, so things like notes. And we've created a draft payment, which we can then approve. So I guess a second gateway, an extra sort of section to make sure that you're doing the right thing. I would imagine moving a lot of money can be quite a scary thing for a small business.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for businesses, we generally see the sums are quite large. So that's kind of why the second approval, I guess the second screen is there, just to make sure that they can confirm that action. And then also I think, as you have kind of user access and kind of other levels, then that becomes also the screen that someone else can use to approve a payment as well.
And that sort of nicely jumps onto the first question, which is the sort of typical user for this type of product. Did you have a job role or a type of user in mind when you were building out these flows? Was there anything
so I think
the way they behave?
Yeah, so I'd say the user here is, when we build tools, probably very much for business, and you find kind of, someone on the finance team is usually the one doing this. So, where a lot of time you have these screens where it's one screen and one screen, what we found was that for the finance team, actually want all the information on one screen, right? You can see kind of what amount, where you're sending from, where you're sending to, all the rates. And so it's kind of part of the design is like having everything on one screen. The other thing you find with businesses is, when it comes to more sophisticated businesses, they're actually very want to see the rate that they're getting, as well as the margin from a rate perspective, right? So we've kind of made a conscious decision to make it look like a rate and a margin from a rate perspective, rather than just a dollar fee, right? And that's kind of the way I think through FX is kind of what's the rate that I'm actually getting, rather than kind of a specific fee.
Okay.
And then the other thing which we probably didn't see in the demo itself is that we have both kind of what we call a local payment type, which is where you can send US dollar into America, but we also have SWIFT capabilities, right? Where you can send different types of currencies into different countries. So for example, US dollar into China. right? Or pounds into a different country, and that is actually quite a important feature for businesses, where they're actually sometimes sending I guess a different currency to what the country that they're sending to is. And that's actually a very common request for businesses.
Really? That's really fascinating. Yeah. I've heard the notion that, especially during these sorts of times, organizations will hold on to dollars in a meaningful sense. I guess what I thought that meant would have been more along the lines of, and you might have some insight into this, is that organizations want to invest in dollars, in US treasuries and in other sort of considered safe financial assets. Is there any sort of general movement towards people holding a specific type of currency from a different country, for example?
Yeah, so what you find is a lot of the Asian countries, especially some that are probably less developed, like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, a lot of them want to deal with US dollars because their currencies can actually be very volatile. So it's actually a hedging mechanism. They're like, I don't want to be paid in money because maybe one day it devalues like straight away and actually get quite a hit on the exchange rates. So they actually want to hold and actually do everything in US dollars from a stability perspective.
Okay, and I guess that's good news for you guys that you can do that sort of thing. Cool. So and then you mentioned also there that there was a sort of some different layers of you could do different layers of permissions for this type of product. You would envisage this existing as being available for a load of different types of user. So, for example, from your company-based financial controller down to the average product manager who's expensing something on their card. What sort of
exactly?
Yeah, you expect
exactly.
a wide range of people.
Yeah, exactly. So, the base case is you have someone on your team that creates the payment, and then you might have the finance director or the CFO approve that payment. That's kind of a very base case. You could have an accountant that might want to actually review the bank statements for your business, but obviously you don't want them to kind of be able to do anything with it. And then as we get into card product, one of the use cases is actually, okay, I need to give an employer, like a product manager, a card to do some expenses, whether it's travel or whether it's buying some subscription software. But I want to be able to set limits on that. I want to be able to safeguard that. So they from a transparency and visibility perspective, that they have the right controls in place.
Right, cool. And did you find were there any complications for designing for these different types of users? Did you find you had to do anything out of the ordinary?
Yeah, it actually I think is very complicated. I think it's probably underestimated how complicated it gets as you start having kind of hierarchy of users and permissions, even the language you use on explaining what different roles are. A lot of different companies have different language. So it actually gets very complicated. So you need to actually do quite a lot of user testing to figure out what the right language is.
Did you employ any specific sort of technical infrastructure to facilitate these sort of movements? You mentioned there the Swift network and that sort of thing. How does that work? Do you build out those capacities yourself? Do you lean on anything that's pre-existing?
Yeah, so the way we do it is we actually have built our own basically payments network. So we have a number of financial partners across the world, and we essentially connect to those banks through an API, and we use those as our payment network, right? So if a bank is, let's say, in Australia, we can use them for domestic payments capabilities, but then we can also use them as a Swift payout as well. So we have a number of these partners across the world in multiple countries.
How would that work specifically? Would you have a US bank account which you'd hold in another country, or would you hold it in the country that you're in?
Yeah, so it actually differs. So there's different banking partners that we work with. Some banking partners allow you to hold US dollar within that country.
Okay.
And then there are other banking partners that only allow us to hold that local currency. So we actually offer our clients a number of different options when it comes to creating that account. The default option is usually the US dollar account in the US. But if they want to also hold that US dollar account in a different country, we can actually provide that as well. So for example, we can offer a US dollar account in Hong Kong as well.
Okay, cool. So we're going to take a look at one of these US dollar accounts. And as you can see, it's you just mentioned there that there's two options here. We can see the location of the bank quite clearly there. There's an Australian one and there's a US one. And we can then select the dollar currency. When you're doing this next section, I guess that's grayed out, that US dollar, as in that's the standard option for you there?
Yeah, exactly. So that was grayed out. But there are kind of ways we can enable that depending on the types of business. And so you can actually then select where you want that US dollar account, whether it's in the US or other country.
Okay, cool. And there you've created that account. Back into this homepage to see other things that can be done. A nice little to-do list. I always like items like that prompt new actions after that. It's always a really smart design. So we've been able to very quickly generate a new business account there. Was there, I guess this is taken from the fact that there are different KYB requirements taken at the beginning of the user's experience or with the product, and therefore they don't need to do anything else once they've already done this initial onboarding step. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we do kind of an extensive KYB that allows them to access the full range of our features. And so kind of what we see is that businesses in general prefer to put all the information up front and then access the features rather than having to kind of provide additional information as they access different products.
But is there anyone else who's doing this sort of thing, in terms of offering business accounts in different countries, and how do you approach those if there are any?
Yeah, look, so there are obviously other people that are offering some of these accounts. I say for these accounts, there's a couple of use cases. I think the common use case is using these potentially as a freelance account. So if you're freelancing or kind of have a business where you have clients overseas, you use those to receive funds. The other use case we find quite common, especially kind of where we've come from, which is kind of China, is using some of these accounts to collect from e-commerce platforms. So there's a big opportunity when they're selling on Amazon US, which I think is actually also quite common in the UK, or you're selling through a platform that gets collections via PayPal, that you can actually connect the US dollar account or even like the pound account if you're from overseas to these marketplaces and be able to receive in the local currency.
Okay.
And then I think, as we have other currencies become available, so you couldn't see on the demo, but we also have Canadian dollar, Hong Kong dollar. And so some businesses do operate in these countries and they use these currency accounts as well to collect income from clients. Okay.
And how does the sort of the foreign exchange work then? I would imagine so the only real way that forgive my ignorance, I don't know much about foreign exchange, but I know that some organizations will use the middle market rate to be able to determine the best price for their end user. But there's an awful lot of complication in terms of calculating at what stage a currency has been locked in for transfer and all that kind of thing as to what rate it is. What's the Airwallex approach? How do you guys think about the exchange rate as a sort of financial mechanism, and what do you offer?
Yeah, so we actually just we probably think of it much more from a business perspective. So when you see that rate, you do see a little bit of a live ticker, and that's actually because it is a live rate, right? We don't kind of mock it at all. And I think we find businesses generally like to see that because they know they're actually getting that market rate. So that's the way we think about it. We do offer the capability through our API to lock the FX rate, because we know that's a common requirement for certain marketplaces. But within kind of our app itself, we offer that live rate.
Okay, and the live rate is is that so? I wouldn't. You might have to educate me a little bit here, but in terms of the live rate, that's just the pure exchange rate that's going on. Whilst if we were to look at something like TransferWise, we might have three rates: the top, the bottom, and the middle, in terms of the projection. Would that be right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know enough about the competitor kind of format, but for us, we basically offer what is out there, which is essentially the mid-market rate. So what you essentially Google is what you get.
Nice. That sounds cool. Interesting. So we'll take a look at the next stage now, which is about the notion of connecting up with your accounting software. So here is the Airwallex Connect to Xero journey. Xero obviously being a big player based over there I believe they're in New Zealand. And you can connect via that button. And this goes straight into what looks like a Xero authorization page going via their API or an API of theirs. Very quickly added a connection there. And then we can connect a range of different currencies. We've seen this happen before, whereby instead of being able to bulk batch send over information, we have to send specific items over. Is that something to do with the way that the API is put together, or is it an individual API call for each currency or each account?
Yeah. So I think the reason is the way it creates the account. It creates individual accounts based on the currency. That's why kind of we've done it, one by one. And also because there is a requirement that if you do disconnect, they also want to be able to reconnect to an existing account.
Okay.
So you could either create a new account in Xero, or you can actually connect to an existing account, which is kind of the way that's designed. But yeah, look, it's a very common feature. Obviously, as you go into international markets like Australia, UK, where Xero, the cloud accounting software, is quite popular. It's really important to be able to synchronize all your transactions with that accounting software. And like you said, accountants then can also go in and check and make sure that everything's reconciling correctly as well.
Why Xero specifically? Is it just because it's the common tool to use across a different sort of range of markets?
Yeah, so we are planning to continue to build out other accounting software integration. So we know obviously QuickBooks is quite popular, both in the UK and in the US. And there's a bunch of other software companies like Sage, I think, and Free Agent. But also Xero is probably one of the larger ones in the markets that we're expanding to, Australia, UK, and US. So that was kind of the first cab off the rank.
Okay, cool. And how did you find the experience of working with their product? I would imagine it's quite sophisticated now. You see a lot of products that can now integrate with them, so they must have got their chops down. Yeah,
they're very friendly from an integration perspective. I think we were actually one of the first kind of fintechs in Australia to go through their banking feed API, which is kind of a new product. So it was pretty seamless. I think we actually got it done within a couple of months. And I actually said it was one of the fastest integrations that they've experienced as well.
That's great. So you've obviously got a good relationship with those guys. How did you find sort of handling the multi-currency aspect of your product? Did Xero have any sort of quirks with handling the fact that they weren't just dealing with dollars or with Australian dollars or anything like that? How did that sort of work for you guys in the sense of multiple accounts, different currencies, and I guess this is mainly based on individual sort of single currency accounts?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the key synergies between our account and Xero. We know that a lot of businesses they're dealing multiple accounts. We also know that the integration with multiple accounts with your traditional bank accounts can be quite difficult. So we were really keen to kind of build that capability and make it a really seamless experience. And even kind of moving money between multiple accounts, through the integration, it's actually very easy to reconcile. And actually makes it quite a seamless experience for our user. The APIs are actually very straightforward. All the kind of currencies that we have, Xero can support as well. So that was actually pretty straightforward.
Nice. And then we're going to take a look finally at the virtual card offering. So this is the virtual card journey. I guess the issuance of a virtual card is important here, as well as the maintaining and controlling the expenditure that comes in and out, the approval or that sort of thing. Nice to hear to see a purpose, I guess, for accounting or
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of used quite common for accounting purposes, just to try to reconcile some of the transactions. And then we also have a limit that you can put in different currencies, put daily, monthly transaction limits, just to give a lot of these finance teams peace of mind in case there is fraud.
Okay. And you can sort of issue these to individuals within the organization, but we've got card details available. Nice to see that kind of hide option on there as well, in the sense of this is going to be a product which is going to be used by multiple people. There's potential to be a lot of eyes on it. So that's really interesting. And then presumably off the back of it, they've been issued their virtual card. They can access it via an app, we'd imagine. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So they can kind of access it through the user access management tools that we have. So you can kind of allow different people to have different access levels. They can see some of these cards, and then we're actually also in the process of building an app that they can kind of use as a digital wallet, as well as a physical card.
Okay. And again, like this basically showcases quite neatly the fact that you have a few different types of user on the platform, and they all have different requirements. We pointed out there one thing, which was the ability to sort of note down what the purpose of the expenditure is. But did you get a lot from sort of testing on different types of users for this? Did you have to double down on the amount of testing that you did for this particular feature based on the fact that there was going to be maybe 2 or 3 different people using it at any one time?
Yeah, so I think you have to kind of talk to both who creates the card, which is usually the finance team or kind of quite a senior person, and then who's the user of the card as well, right? So you need to kind of understand both of those users. Obviously, the person that's creating the card wants the control, right? They want to be able to set the limits, they want to be able to set the purpose of the card, and the one who's actually using it wants to kind of have the transparency. They want to know how much is left on the card they can spend.
Sure.
So that's kind of the two use cases that we need to really take into account.
And just a few general questions before we wrap up. But I wanted to ask you before we kind of wrapped up a little bit about the product teams or the way that sort of like development happens at Airwallex. So I'd imagine that you have pretty standard Scrum type teams.
Yep.
How do you split the responsibility to different teams? Any sort of tips for how to continuously deliver product?
Yeah, so I think for us, we have feature teams. So usually they're around, 6 to 8 people, PM, UXer / UI, Eng lead, and a team of devs. Can be a mix of kind of, back front end and back end. So that's kind of the way we think about the feature teams.
Yeah.
In the way we kind of think about our teams, we probably have certain feature teams that are much more focused on the back end. So kind of that platform API product, and then feature teams that are more focused on the front end. So kind of our SME, we'll call SME banking product. Okay. In terms of kind of continuous delivery, I think, there's a number of levels. At the high level is being clear on what our product strategy is, right? So we have a number of kind of very clear segments that we're going after. We use a framework called jobs to be done to really identify what are some of the pain points for these segments that we really want to solve from a financial services perspective. That strategy then turns into OKRs, where we try to be very clear on what are the objectives and what are the metrics we want to move. And those OKRs, they can translate into a roadmap. And then that roadmap basically has kind of 2 components. One is a discovery component, which is obviously largely led by the product manager and the design team. And then there's also kind of a development or delivery component. So we kind of work that in parallel.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'd heard the one thing that we often think a little bit about is the notion of these like parallel tracks and how you basically get them working cyclically, so that they're sort of like, might sound a little bit too structured, but like, essentially 2-week design track that hands nicely off to 2-week development sprint or development track. It's a constant challenge, I think, that a lot of people are trying to wrestle with. Do you find that works well for you guys? And the makeup of that particular team, you're quite dev heavy, maybe compared to some companies, would you say?
Yeah. So I'd say, I think the way we build our products, it's actually quite infrastructure heavy, which is why it's probably a little bit more dev heavy. We're probably not as strict as kind of having 2 week. Like we definitely operate sprints, but some of that kind of discovery could go longer, right? Could be like a 1 week, like a 1 sprint, could be 2 sprints. But we definitely try to have that parallel tracked process where something needs to be very clear from a requirement perspective and from a design perspective before it goes into dev. Right?
Yep.
So we kind of try to run that process.
Got you. Cool. Nice one. So just a few final questions before we go. The first one being 2020 plans. Obviously, a lot of things have gotten in the way this year of maybe making the progress that you guys would want to. A bit of disruption, that sort of thing. But this is going to be a great sort of leveler for everyone, presumably, like the notion of international sort of financial currency exchange, that sort of thing. You guys will do well out of this, right?
Yeah, so I think 2020 for us, obviously there's been unfortunate circumstances, but we actually think that this trend towards a digital economy is actually accelerating because of the current circumstances.
Yeah.
More and more people are selling online.
Mhm.
International travel has probably slowed down, but I think that's probably a blip, right? We should probably see that'll recover over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
And I think cross-border e-commerce or commerce in general will also accelerate because of the move to online. So we think all the macro trends are there. And so we just need to make sure that we can support businesses as they think about growing or expanding their operations overseas.
Cool. And what sort of big things are you looking to do for the rest of the year then?
Yeah, so I think for us, our real focus for 2020 is kind of that expansion into UK and Europe. So we have a number of kind of big announcements coming up, both from a hiring perspective as well as from a product launch perspective into that market. And then, being pretty aggressive and continuing to expand our product suite to meet business needs.
Right, got you. And I guess you'll be keeping people up to date with those things on things like social media, that sort of thing. Anywhere in particular that people can find out a little bit more about you and maybe the work that Airwallex are doing?
Yeah, so our website is probably the best place. So www.airwallex.com is a great source of information about our product. And then you can also follow us on social media, so LinkedIn, Twitter.
Okay. And are you yourself active on any of the social media platforms?
I'm trying to be more active on LinkedIn. I'm probably not as active as I could be. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the one platform I'm more active on than the others.
Well, there we go. Thank you very much for your time, Neil. That's been a really instructive conversation.
No, thank you so much, James. I appreciate it.
Today's episode is brought to you, as usual, by the 11FS Pulse platform. This is the platform that sits underneath and powers everything we do here at 11FS Homescreen. We have a range of different video journeys that we use to analyze and see what's going on out there in the market. Airwallex is just one example of different content that we'll have on the platform. What we can do is show off different types of user experience and talk to the people that brought about those different experiences. So check in pulse.11fs.com to see what's going on with that. And I'll find us on Twitter at 11FS Pulse. Thanks very much for tuning into this week's episode of Homescreen with Airwallex. Thank you, Neil, for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.